Today I'm going to be talking about the subscription value loop. This is a proprietary framework I've developed over the last year and a half that helps consumer subscription businesses grow. And I'm not just going to talk about a theoretical framework. I'm also going to be talking about a tool called the subscription value loop calculator that will help you measure your own performance as a consumer subscription app and identify your biggest growth opportunities. So we got a lot to cover. I'm going to jump in, but before I do, a bit about me. So as I said, my name's Phil Carter. I'm currently a full-time growth advisor and angel investor. I have a firm called Elemental Growth where I advise consumer subscription businesses. Prior to that, I spent 7 years leading product and growth teams at $3 billion plus companies, Fair, Quizlet, and Ibotta. And then I also have some experience as an early stage venture capital investor. So I have some experience doing this, especially during the 4 years that I spent leading the growth team at Quizlet. And today I'm going to be talking about three things. So number one is the problem. And the problem is that consumer subscription apps are easy to launch, but hard to scale. And it's harder than it's ever been for reasons that I'll describe in a moment. Number two is the subscription value loop. So this is the framework that I'll get into. And it goes through how to grow sustainably as a consumer subscription app in 3 steps: value creation, value delivery, and value capture. And then finally, we're going to get into the subscription value loop calculator. And this is a tool that I've been developing in partnership with RevenueCat that will help you quantify the performance of your own subscription value loop and identify your biggest growth opportunities. I'll also be talking about a few specific growth tactics that some of the top consumer subscription businesses use to accelerate their growth. Yesterday, I talked about many more of them. Today, I'm not going to have as much time, so I'll just talk about a few. All right, so let's start with the problem. And as I said, the problem is consumer subscription apps are easy to launch, but they're really hard to scale. Well, why is that? Let's step back for a moment and talk about the growing consumer subscription economy. And Ariel talked a little bit about this, right? There are lots of trends that suggest that consumer subscription businesses are doing really well. 5% of apps in the App Store are doing more than close to 50% of the revenue. Since Apple and Google introduced subscriptions into the App Stores in 2011 and 2012, we've seen this huge proliferation in consumer subscription businesses. So there are now hundreds of thousands of these apps in the App Store. And thank you to Ariel for providing that number as well. But when you really zoom in, there haven't been that many big success stories, right? Hundreds of thousands of consumer subscription apps, less than 50 have ever reached a $1 billion valuation, and less than 10 have ever surpassed $10 billion market cap. And that's across both private and publicly traded companies, right? So there just aren't that many big outcomes that we've seen in this space. And what's more surprising is they're confined to just 4 categories, right? Media and entertainment, health and fitness, social and lifestyle, and education. So far, that's where most or all of the big outcomes have been. And this is why many venture capitalists simply won't invest in this category, or if they do, they're only investing in the very, very best businesses. And it gets even tougher, right? Because even if you look at the few companies that have made it to the promised land that are publicly traded consumer subscription businesses, even these companies have seen a lot of volatility. So over the last 5 to 6 years, there have been 5 consumer subscription businesses that have gone public: Dropbox, Spotify, Bumble, Duolingo, and Grindr. And these companies have seen a lot of volatility since the tailwinds of the pandemic have subsided, right? There was a lot of government stimulus. People had a lot of time on their hands, so they were shifting some of the money they were previously spending for vacations or for eating out at restaurants to digital subscription products. Well, that began to subside coming off of the pandemic. And as a result, a lot of these companies saw their revenue multiples decline. And companies that were less well-funded, that weren't public, many of them just simply went out of business because they couldn't handle all of those ups and downs. So the good news is consumer subscription apps are easier to launch than a lot of other more complex business models like enterprise SaaS businesses or marketplaces. Well, why is that? They don't require sales teams for the most part. They have fast purchase cycles. Most of them don't have to deal with complex two-sided marketplace dynamics. They have low marginal cost to serving additional subscribers. They have high gross margins that generally improve as the company scales. And they can leverage the app stores for global distribution and turnkey support tools. And so all of this just means these companies can get off the ground quickly, and they can get to market faster and with less outside capital. So that's great, and that's part of why there's so many of them. But there's another side to that coin, and that is that these companies are really hard to scale. Once you hit a certain point, it becomes hard to find more users. It becomes hard to keep those users, and it's harder to monetize those users. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. Why is finding users hard? Well, it's the other side of the coin of what I just talked about, right? They don't have sales teams. They're very reliant on Apple and Google for distribution. And so what that means is a lot of them end up depending heavily on Facebook and other paid marketing channels for growth. And that means a lot of pressure on customer acquisition costs. As CAC goes up, it's hard to maintain healthy unit economics. The second problem is that keeping users is hard, right? And this one's fairly obvious. Relative to B2B SaaS businesses, churn rates are much higher. Consumers are fickle, so it's easy come, easy go, and it's hard to build a sustainable business if you have high churn rates. And then finally, monetizing users is hard, right? If you look at marketplaces, B2B SaaS businesses, or even social networks, all of those models have ways of extracting more value out of their whales, out of their most valuable users. So how do they do it? B2B SaaS businesses land and expand. And so their most valuable accounts end up becoming more and more valuable over time. And so even if they churn some of their accounts, their net revenue retention is often over 100% in the best cases. With marketplaces, as they reach a tipping point, they get more and more liquidity. That means more transactions, which means more average revenue per user. And then if you look at social networks, it's just all about eyeballs and engagement, right? It's why Facebook and Instagram are doing everything they can to get more users and to get those users to spend more time on their networks, and that means more revenue. But with consumer subscriptions, a lot of them just have a single subscription tier. And so there's only so much value they can capture, even from their best users. But you don't just have to take my word for it, right? RevenueCat has a data set of more than 30,000 consumer subscription apps that use their SDK, representing close to 300 million subscribers and almost $7 billion in subscription revenue. And what's staggering about these numbers, if you look closely, is that even the top quartile apps, the apps in the top 25%, they're only converting less than 6% of installs into subscribers. And then they're churning more than 50% of their annual subscribers in the first year and more than 50% of their monthly subscribers in the first 3 months, right? And so that's tough. Even if you're in the top quartile, in most cases, that's not going to support a venture scale business. It's just not good enough. But the story starts to look a lot more promising if you look beyond the top quartile to the very top 5%, right? Apps in the 95th percentile are converting more than 3 times as many installs into subscribers, 17.1%. And they're maintaining retention rates over 60% on annual subscribers after the first year and on monthly subscribers after the first 3 months. And so if you're a venture capitalist, and I was at one point, you look at these numbers and you say, okay, I can invest in a company like this. This can be a successful long-term business. This can be $1 billion plus outcome. So what does this mean? It means being a consumer subscription business is hard, but it's not impossible. And so then the next question is, well, what are the top subscription apps doing in order to break out and beat the odds? So in this section, we're going to talk about the subscription value loop. And specifically, we're going to talk about 2 things. Number 1, your core value promise. How do you develop a core value promise for your product that stands out from the crowd? And then number 2, how do you use that core value promise to power these 3 steps in the loop: value creation, value delivery, and value capture? All right, so let's start with the value promise. The value promise is the beating heart of your product, right? It's what drives the loop. And in order to succeed, you need a core value promise that is both unique and enduring. And so I use these 2 words intentionally. Why unique? Well, Ariel talked about it earlier, right? There are more consumer subscription apps than ever in the app stores. And so no matter what category you're in, no matter how small your niche, you probably have at least one, if not many, competitors. So you need something, some differentiated angle or technology or feature that allows you to stand out from the crowd. And then you need a value promise that's enduring, right? Because subscription businesses in particular rely on recurring revenue from subscribers who come back and pay you again and again and again. If you don't have that, at least from your best subscribers, then you don't have a sustainable business model. And so if you look at the top consumer subscription apps, and I've listed a few of them on here, you can see that their value promises are synonymous with the brand, right? Even if I took the names of these companies away, you would probably know who I'm talking about. I won't go through all of them, but if I told you I was talking about gamified study experiences, you would immediately think Duolingo. Or if I said, find attractive singles in a single swipe, you would think about Tinder. Okay, so you need a strong core value promise. And then that core value promise drives these 3 steps in your subscription value loop: value creation, value delivery, and value capture. So let's talk a little bit more about each one of these. Value creation is all about building a world-class product. This is the foundation for everything else. The more value you create with your product team, the more potential you have to easily distribute that value, often organically through word of mouth, and the more potential you have to capture that value through subscriptions or other purchases. So that's value creation led by core product teams. Second, you have value delivery. This is all about cost efficiently distributing your product to as many users as possible, ideally not just through paid advertising, right? Because that's what's going to get you in trouble. You want to find ways to distribute your product organically through word of mouth or SEO. And then finally is value capture. And value capture is about converting free users into subscribers and generating enough subscription revenue from those subscribers to be able to reinvest those resources back into the business, back into product innovation and paid marketing campaigns. And if you do this really well, the loop starts to spin faster and faster, your LTV over CAC ratio goes up, your payback period comes down, and you become a stronger and stronger business. So let's just briefly talk about 3 examples of this. I'll start with value creation. That's the foundation of everything else, as I said before. And the obvious example here is Duolingo. I feel like Duolingo gets so much love in all these conferences, but that's for good reason, right? They've done a tremendous job. Their current market cap is over $11 billion. And so they do so many things well when it comes to value creation. Number 1 is immersive onboarding. And I'm guessing almost everyone in this room has tried Duolingo at least once. If you open the Duolingo app for the first time, they don't just tell you, hey, we're Duolingo, we're the best language learning app in the world. They ask you a couple questions about what language you want to learn, what your current proficiency level is, how much time you have to devote to language learning every day. And then they show you how great their product is, right? They drop you straight into your first language learning lesson. You see how learning a language on Duolingo is different with streaks and badges and other gamification techniques. And so you understand within the first few minutes why learning a language on Duolingo is fun, it's engaging, and you're probably going to come back again and again. I already talked about gamification, streaks, leaderboards, badges, achievements, and they reinforce all of that with notifications, and you can read a lot more about that online. And then all of this leads to personalized lessons. The product literally adapts to your unique needs as you take lesson after lesson after lesson, and proven efficacy. So there have been research papers written on how Duolingo is approaching the same level of efficacy now as taking a college language learning course, which is really impressive. And now they're starting to expand into math and music as well, which will be interesting to watch. Okay, so that's value creation. Value delivery, I'm going to talk about Strava. So Strava is a company that has leveraged one of its most powerful growth assets to grow organically, and that's its highly engaged community of athletes. And so if you think about how Strava grows, yes, they do some paid marketing, and they've gotten more and more efficient with their paid marketing campaigns, but they have all these other ways of growing through viral word of mouth, not just in real life, right? If you go run a marathon or you go to a cycling event, you're going to have people talking about Strava and telling you, if it's not on Strava, it didn't happen, right? So they get all this benefits from in-person word of mouth, from sharing on social media, people recording their workouts and posting that to Facebook, to Instagram, to TikTok. And then they have influencer marketing campaigns, and they have their annual Camp Strava event where they bring together people from around the world to meet with some of their most famous athletes. All of that keeps their organic acquisition percentage of total growth very high, which keeps their blended acquisition cost low. And then finally, we have Tinder, which is a great example of value capture. And I said before that your value promise needs to be enduring. Well, in the dating category, that's tough, because if you have a great product, at some point, hopefully, people are going to stop using it because they find the right partner. But Tinder has done a really good job of innovating on how they capture value from their best subscribers or even non-subscribers very early on in their user journey. So they have multiple subscription tiers. They've expanded beyond Tinder Plus to Tinder Gold and Tinder Platinum. They have these consumable in-app purchases like boosts and super likes that are complementary to their 3 subscription tiers. And then they've done all the obvious stuff like price testing and optimization, contextual upsells, and so on and so forth. And that helps to ensure they're getting as much value capture from their user base as they can. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. We have a framework for how to grow consumer subscription businesses. But these theoretical frameworks aren't very helpful unless you can actually apply them in the real world, right? Things break down quickly when you're talking about a specific company, a specific product. So last, we're going to talk about the subscription value loop calculator and how to quantify your loop and identify your biggest growth opportunities. So first, I'll just briefly talk about why this is so important. I gave you 3 examples of companies that do these steps particularly well: value creation, value delivery, value capture. Well, what about companies that have failed on one or more of these dimensions? So these are 3 cautionary tales of companies that were once flying very high, but because they failed on one of the 3 steps in the subscription value loop, their growth really ground to a halt. So the first one is Chegg. During the pandemic, Chegg was the darling of Wall Street, right? They reached a $15 billion market cap. Everybody needed Chegg to learn remotely. But what happened was, as the pandemic subsided, as students returned to in-classroom learning, the need for Chegg's products declined. And then as generative AI came into the picture, there are just more and more and more cheap or even free substitutes for their core value promise around textbook solutions. And as you can see in this chart, that caused subscriber growth to decline, it's caused their revenue to decline, and their market cap is now less than $200 million. Second example is Blue Apron. And Blue Apron failed on value delivery. This is probably the most common failure point for a lot of consumer subscription businesses, which is very simple. You just get overly reliant on paid advertising, usually on Facebook or Google. And then at some point, as you move beyond your highest intent early adopters, your paid acquisition costs go up, your LTVs go down, and your unit economics no longer work. So that's exactly what happened to Blue Apron. And you can see here their growth rates across revenue, customers, orders, all declined, and their business is not doing well today. And then finally, you have Pandora. And Pandora did so many things right. It was the first mover in many ways in the streaming music space. I remember in college, all of my friends and I used Pandora. It was a great product. The problem was they weren't capturing enough value from their users. They were an ad-supported model. And so Spotify comes along. They have this subscription business model. They're capturing one, if not multiple orders of magnitude more revenue per user. And what does that mean? Well, it means they're capturing all these additional resources that they can reinvest into things like product innovation and paid marketing campaigns. And so at some point, they leapfrogged Pandora and became the #1 player in the space and are now worth many, many times more than Pandora ever was. OK, so enter the subscription value loop calculator. And this is a tool that allows you to quantify your company's performance in 5 steps. Number 1, identify the metrics that drive value creation, value delivery, and value capture. Number 2, calculate your company's recent performance against those metrics. Number 3, compare that performance against each metric versus benchmarks, and specifically benchmarks in your app's category and by percentile. So you can look at 25th, 50th, 75th, or 95th percentile apps. Number 4, identify opportunities based on metrics where you underperform. And number 5, prioritize specific initiatives to improve growth metrics with the greatest upside potential. And this tool exists publicly. So if you go online and you look up subscription value loop calculator, or I wrote a guest post for Lenny's newsletter that has more information on this tool and how to use it. So feel free to check it out and plug your own company's numbers in. But this is really helpful, right? Because you can understand for your company specifically, in your category, relative to the percentile of apps you want to focus on, where are your biggest opportunities? And so here's a hypothetical example of how this looks. This is an actual screenshot of the tool. I realize the numbers are small, so you're not going to be able to read everything. Pay attention to the heat map in the last column. Because what this shows is, this is a hypothetical education company, right? It's underperforming on LTV over CAC and payback period. But the next important question is why? Like, what are the underlying weaknesses in this company's business model that are causing it to underperform? And so in this particular case, when you dig under the hood, there are 3 problems. Number 1, acquisition costs are too high. So if you look on the value delivery row towards the bottom middle, they're underperforming on cost per install, cost per trial, and cost per subscriber. Number 2, share of annual plans is too low. They're at only 20% annual plans as part of their overall subscription portfolio. The benchmark is over 60%. And then finally, monthly subscribers are retaining at far lower rates than annual subscribers. So it's not like this gives them the solution to all of their problems, but at least now they know where to focus. They know that maybe their annual subscription price is too high. Maybe they need to do more to retain monthly subscribers. And they certainly need to do more to improve the efficiency of their user acquisition. And so by focusing in those areas, they can figure out specific product and marketing initiatives to improve their performance. So to close things out here, I'm just going to give you 3 examples, one for each step, of specific growth tactics that companies can use to improve their performance in these steps. And if you read the Lenny's newsletter post, it'll go into a lot more detail. The talk I gave yesterday also gave you a lot more tactics, but this is sort of a sample of what's out there. So we'll start with value creation. One of the most important parts of value creation is onboarding. And so the best consumer subscription apps are finding ways to connect new users to the value of their product very, very quickly, ideally within the first 2 to 3 minutes of opening the app for the first time. And there are a few things you can do to do that. You can emphasize your core value promise right away. You can use SSO options like Google, Facebook, and Apple in order to streamline registration. You can personalize the experience by asking the user onboarding quiz questions and then adjusting your content recommendations or which features you're pushing them based on their responses. And the example here is Headway. Headway is a book summary app that competes with Blinkist. They're now the #1 most downloaded book summary app in the world. And you can see they do all of these things, right? Within the first 30 seconds, you know they're a book summary app. You know they're the #1 most downloaded book summary app in the world. You're able to register in a couple clicks with an SSO option, and then they ask you a couple questions around how many minutes per day do you spend reading, and what content are you interested in, so that by the end of this, you have a personalized plan just for you. Number 2 is value delivery. So this is the word of mouth coefficient. Many of you are probably familiar with Net Promoter Score, NPS. And NPS is a great metric. You know, on a scale from 0 to 10, how likely would you be to recommend this product to a friend or colleague? That's a helpful starting point, but it doesn't actually tell you how much virality is happening on your platform. So the word of mouth coefficient, which was created by a guy named Yusuf Baiji when he was at Zynga, goes one step further, and it looks at this ratio of the new word of mouth users coming to your product for every existing active user you have, either returning users or new non-word of mouth users. And if you look at the word of mouth coefficient online, you can look more specifically at how you delineate word of mouth versus not word of mouth users. That's the hardest part of this. Also say it's not a perfectly accurate metric, but it's directionally accurate enough that it helps uncover some real insights. And so when I was at Quizlet, we measured the word of mouth coefficient. It just so happened to be right around the time of the pandemic. And we saw some really interesting things. Our word of mouth coefficient tended to be really high during back to school periods like August and September, and then again in January. Also during key exam periods in December and May and June, but low during the summer. That much was pretty obvious. But then when the pandemic hit, our word of mouth coefficient plummeted across the board, across every country in the world. But then something interesting happened. It actually rebounded, and in many cases, it ended up higher than it was prior to the pandemic. And when we broke this down by country, we could actually guess which countries were recovering from the pandemic and transitioning to remote learning faster than others based off of the trends we saw in their word of mouth coefficient. So based on that insight, we developed product and marketing initiatives to bolster word of mouth during the most important times of year, and that helped us keep our blended acquisition costs down. And then finally, I know I'm out of time here, value capture. So I'm going to focus here on pricing and packaging. I've consistently seen pricing and packaging optimizations drive 5 to 15% lift in subscription revenue growth when done right. A couple specific tools I'll point you to. There are many of them out there, but Van Westendorp and conjoint analysis are two great price study tools that you can use to optimize the pricing of your product. I won't go into the details now. You can read more about conjoint and Van Westendorp analysis online. But the example I'll give you is AllTrails. So AllTrails started off with a price of $49.99 when they were first getting started. They were targeting high intent users like backcountry skiers, hiking enthusiasts, search and rescue professionals. And that price point worked for that early adopter group. But then as they wanted to expand to a more mainstream audience in order to expand their TAM to a more casual hiker audience, they needed to lower their price. And so they lowered their price to $29.99. They left it there for a while. But then as they added more premium features and they improved the quality of their product, they realized they were underpricing and leaving money on the table. So they brought in an agency. They did conjoint and Van Westendorp analysis. They figured out that the right price point was in the mid-30s. And then finally, they ran a pricing A/B test in the product experience and figured out that our optimal price point was $35.99 per year. And that led to an 8% lift in ARR per exposed user in the A/B test. All right, so key takeaways. I'm going to wrap up here. If you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this. Consumer subscription apps are easy to launch but hard to scale. Number two, the best apps drive sustainable growth through a subscription value loop with 3 steps: value creation, value delivery, and value capture. And number 3, the subscription value loop calculator can help you identify your biggest growth opportunities and prioritize proving tactics to unlock additional growth and achieve your full potential. So that's my talk for today. I hope you learned something. I hope if you already saw this talk yesterday, you learned something else. And if I can ever be helpful, please let me know. You can find me at philgcarter.com or at Phil G. Carter on LinkedIn, X, and Substack. I'd love to hear more about your business and see if there's anything I can do to be helpful. Thank you very much, everyone.